Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two more confusing and disturbing cases. In particular, the second one starts off seeming very plain and straightforward, and then with each revelation just gets more and more horrifying. So as always, viewer discretion is advised. On September 20th, 1987, Roy Harris worked an early Sunday shift at Georgia Pacific's pulp and tissue mill in West Bellingham. One of the areas of the mill that Roy looked after was the 10 boilers that preheated steam for the use in making tissue. Some of these were only used occasionally, so they weren't checked as often as the others, and Boiler 9 was one of those. That morning, around 5:20 a.m., an alarm went off attached to that boiler. Usually this meant a leak, so Roy shut the boiler down and then set off from the control room to the plant to take a look. When he got there, the problem seemed to be in the smokestack, so Roy started by trying to unlock and open the little door at the bottom. Weirdly, it was stuck as if something was blocking it, so Roy realized he'd have to look down the stack from above, so he took the special ladders used for getting to the top of the chimney and went to climb the 3 staircases that led to the roof. Stack number 9 was about 10 feet across and 17 feet high. It also didn't really look like a chimney, more like a box sticking out of the roof, and then at the top was an opening about 4.5 feet wide to let the steam out. Roy then climbed up the ladder, walked along the short catwalk to the mouth of the chimney and stuck his head through the gap. And immediately he realized it wasn't a leak. Laying at the bottom of the stack was a partially charred, partially skeletonized human body. Now, the pipes running under the corpse often got as hot as 380 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius, but unless it was on and had been on for a while, the stack would rarely get hotter than 35 Celsius or 95 Fahrenheit. So because of its condition, the body seemed to have been there for at least a few weeks, and in that time, the boiler had been brought up to maximum temperature several times. This resulted in it getting so severely burned that it was later difficult to extract any DNA. In fact, even retrieving the body was difficult. The police couldn't get the door at the bottom open, so they had to haul it out from the top. Then as they lifted, they noticed a coat had been draped over the lower pipes as if to shield the body from the heat. Around the corpse as well was what was left of denim jeans and a denim or blue jacket, a shirt, and some shoes with rubber soles. The body also wasn't wearing its shirt. Instead, the shirt was wrapped around an ankle, almost as if it was being used as a bandage for some kind of injury. Horrifyingly, this and the coat draped over the pipes suggested this person had been alive in the chimney for a while. If that wasn't already strange enough, upon retrieving the body, there wasn't anything to identify the person like a wallet or keys. They did find a bunch of papers that might be what was left of a person's wallet, and the police used infrared and ultraviolet photography to try and read the papers, but they were too badly damaged. They also found the charred remains of an American Airlines baggage ticket, but it was also so badly damaged they could only make out 6 numbers, not nearly enough to give them a lead. Even without any information though, police didn't think the victim was a worker at the mill or an outside contractor. This is because there was no record of a worker going missing, and more importantly, everyone who had worked there in the previous weeks and months had collected their weekly paychecks without fail. Also, there was just no way a shift manager would have let someone in there in regular shoes. The safety rules were strict, and the person would have been in steel-toed boots if they'd been working on something. They also would have had to wear a safety helmet too, which wasn't found either. So 3 days later, on September 23rd, police released a statement that the remains were those of a man between 20 and 40 years old who was 5 foot 9 inches tall and likely weighed somewhere between 130 and 155 pounds. He also had small feet at about a size 8 and extensive dental work with both porcelain and gold fillings, along with evidence of having a root canal. The next thing police tried to figure out was how he'd gotten into the chimney in the first place. The broken bones and how hard it was to open the hatch suggests a fall, but the makeshift bandage suggested some of the injuries might have happened earlier. However, it was later discovered that the man actually had several broken bones, including a cracked pelvis, broken femurs, and 2 fractured ankles. The pathologist at the time said the way the legs were broken meant they hadn't simply snapped in the intense heat, they were definitely caused by a fall, so the man had likely fallen down from the top. As the police continued to figure out how the man ended up there, they also tried in vain to identify him. You would think that with such a distinctive dental record, it would be easy to figure out who the man was, but dental records only become accessible once someone gets reported missing. And whoever this person was, no one seems to have missed them. So with so little to go on, the police sent photographs of the skull to an anthropologist who specialized in facial reconstruction. A sketch was then made of a man with dark wavy hair, large eyes set back from a small but pointed nose, and with a slight underbite over a strong square jaw. This sketch was put out to the public, but no one came forward to identify the man, so in the year 2000, a new sketch was drawn, this time from the skull itself. This one was slightly different, and this time the man was portrayed as having short, lighter hair and a large nose and ears, but still, no one seemed to recognize the man and come forward. As if this all wasn't weird enough already, once news reports came out about the discovery, a worker at a nearby steam plant at Western Washington University came forward with some interesting information. Apparently, prior to the body being found, he'd given someone a tour at the university. The visitor was about the right height, weight, and age, and was wearing jeans and tennis shoes. When the visitor first showed up, they were shy, so the worker offered a tour. They eagerly took up the offer and weirdly really wanted to see what it was like inside the chimneys. The worker then took the visitor to an inactive stack and let them climb in. They did this a few times, huddling atop of the pipes each time. Eventually, this became a little weird and the worker wanted the visitor to leave, so he pointed out the stacks used by the Georgia-Pacific mill, which were visible from the university, as a great example of chimneys in action. Afterward, the visitor was apparently very interested in them and then left. Then, sometime after that weird encounter, the worker found out about the body in the smokestack at the mill. He then went straight to the police and told them what happened, but there was a problem. The visitor had been a woman, and all of the forensics indicated it was a man's body. Like, for example, the victim's pelvis was too narrow and too heavy to be a female. Apparently, this method of identifying a person is roughly 95% accurate, so to this day, the police are confident it was the body of a man. So, that's sort of where the case is today. Police aren't sure if it was an accident or someone chose to jump in or they were pushed. Being pushed seems unlikely given how hard it was to get to the top of the chimney. One man getting up there on his own would have been hard enough to do without being seen. Two men climb up the stairs while also carrying the special ladders needed to ascend the chimney almost certainly would have been noticed by the workers who were there every day round the clock. In addition, despite the plane ticket being too badly damaged to identify, it did seem as though the person had a return ticket booked. The old paper boarding tickets had a little perforated section to tear off upon boarding, and this section was still attached. This makes it seem as though the person still had a flight they intended to catch. So is it possible that the pathologist was within the margin of error and that the woman given the tour really was the person found? Maybe that's why no one recognized the sketches. Unfortunately, without DNA or access to dental records, the mystery continues. December 29th, 1999 was a day Ashley Freeman had been looking forward to for a long time. This is because she was turning 16 years old and would finally be able to get her driver's license. First thing the next morning, Ashley's mother, Kathy, planned to take her to the Department of Motor Vehicles for her driving test. It was as exciting as it was nerve-wracking, but before that, she was also looking forward to her birthday party. The evening of her birthday, she planned to have a birthday dinner followed by a sleepover with her friends. For dinner, Ashley decided to go to Pizza Hut, but when it came time to head to Ashley's home for the sleepover, all but one of her friends backed out. Ashley was disappointed, but thankfully, the friend who didn't was the one who had been by her side since kindergarten. Ashley and this friend, Loria Bible, were the best of friends and were so close that Loria's mother often got a kick out of how frequently the two could finish each other's sentences. If you didn't know any better, you'd swear they were sisters just by looking at them. Ashley was 5'7", had light brown hair and blue eyes, while Loria was the older of the two by 8 months and slightly shorter than Ashley with brown hair and hazel eyes. Both of them also showed a lot of promise for the future. Loria was a cheerleader who excelled at school and had dreams of becoming a cosmetologist after graduation. Ashley, on the other hand, was a National Honor Society member and a star basketball player. To add to the similarities, neither of the girls lived a life of privilege, Ashley in particular. Ashley's father, Danny, owned a mobile home and a plot of land. Their nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, and their trailer didn't have running water or any kind of climate control system. During the winters, the family relied on a wood-burning stove to heat their home. However, the family didn't mind the more rustic lifestyle. They loved the outdoors, hunting for their food, and living about as close to off-grid as they could. But although they enjoyed their simple life, the home hadn't been the same since the death of Ashley's brother the year before. Ashley's older brother Shane had a reputation as a troublemaker who couldn't keep himself out of the backseat of a police car. In 1998, Shane stole his uncle's truck. Then, to kick off 1999, he broke into Loria's house and stole money and firearms while the family was out. About a week later, on January 8th, Shane was driving a car that broke down, and as he was attempting to figure out what was going on, a police officer pulled up behind him to check things out. The officer only intended to lend a hand to Shane if he needed it, but when Shane noticed the officer approaching, he stepped away from his vehicle, brought his hand behind him, and pulled out a gun from his waistband. Before Shane could even raise his weapon, the officer shot and killed him. Apparently, the car Shane was driving was stolen, and it's likely he thought that was the reason for being pulled over. In the aftermath, the family did the best they could to move past Shane's death, but obviously things would never be truly the same. Almost a year later on Ashley's birthday, in addition to her driver's test, Lauria had a dentist appointment early the next morning, so after a brief visit by Ashley's boyfriend and a little TV, the girls fell asleep. The following morning at around 5 a.m., a call came into 911 with a neighbor reporting that the family's trailer was on fire. Firefighters and police rushed to the property and found the trailer completely engulfed in flames. It would be well after sunrise when the smoldering remains were safe enough to investigate, and later that afternoon, Kathy's charred body was found in the debris. Weirdly though, there was no sign at all of Danny or the two girls anywhere in and around what was left of the trailer. The fire department then confirmed arson was the cause of the fire, so Danny jumped to the top of the suspect list. When the property had been searched, emergency personnel wrapped things up and headed back to their stations. Detectives, meanwhile, got right to work trying to find Danny, but no one had seen or heard from him since the day before. Along with his absence, there were a lot of reasons to focus on Danny in particular. Not only is the significant other almost always the first person to look at in a case of foul play, but over the years, Danny built quite the reputation around their town. In August of 1998, Danny was arrested after Shane showed up to school one day with blood across the back of his pants. When asked by a school counselor, Shane admitted that he was bruised and bleeding after Danny punished him the night before. Danny was tried for this, but the judge acquitted him after denying a request by the jury to sentence Danny to counseling. Apparently, Kathy's parents had also long known that Danny was violent toward her, but he was never arrested or held accountable for it. In fact, even several years earlier in 1985, Danny was arrested for assaulting his father-in-law for trimming their bushes without his permission. So based on his past, police felt that if Danny was in a mood the night before and he was pushed far enough, there was really no telling what he was truly capable of. However, police hadn't worked this theory much before news came along that threw everything out the window. On December 31st, so the day after the fire, Lauria's parents drove to the Freeman's property to search around the ashes for anything police or firefighters might have missed. And in just 5 minutes, Lauria's father discovered a body under a pile of blackened debris. It was a horrific find, and the body was so severely burned that it was impossible to tell if it belonged to a child or an adult, or even a male or female. Weirdly as well, everything from the upper teeth to the crown of the head was missing too, which is not characteristic of burn victims. Police then returned to the scene to examine and retrieve the body, as well as to perform another, more thorough search of the property, although nothing else was found. But either way, the body was eventually confirmed as belonging to Danny. After this discovery, the investigation was turned over to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, or OSBI, who were better trained and equipped to work on a case like that. Then, with so little to go on, they briefly entertained the possibility that maybe Ashley and Lauria killed Danny and Kathy, set the trailer on fire, and then fled. Supposedly, in anticipation of her birthday and getting her driver's license, Ashley spent the whole year saving up every penny she made to buy a car she had her eye on. Danny, however, wanted her to buy a different vehicle, and this turned into a series of increasingly heated arguments the closer Ashley's birthday got. This was hardly enough to suggest the girls had done something so drastic, however, and it wouldn't be long before the autopsies came back with some troubling information. Autopsies performed on Danny and Kathy's bodies confirmed that the couple wasn't killed in a fire, they were killed by a shotgun. The back of Kathy's head was gone, as was most of Danny's head. It was also determined that Danny's right collarbone was fractured right before he was killed, indicating some kind of struggle. For the OSBI, there was now no doubt that the couple was murdered, but why they were killed and where Ashley and Lauria were was still a total mystery. Meanwhile, Danny's brother believed he had a good idea of why this was all happening. In his mind, this was all payback by the police for Danny daring to challenge them. After Shane's death, the family was considering a civil suit against the department. Danny's brother said that the deputies harassed Danny and the rest of the family for months in an attempt to intimidate them into backing down. Danny's brother alleges the police told him they could do anything to him, Kathy, or Ashley that they wanted. One day, Danny apparently even told his brother that if anything ever happened to him or his family, the police would be behind it. However, in response, several officers, including the one who shot Shane, took lie detectors about Shane's death and the fire, and all passed without issue. As the investigation continued, search efforts to find Ashley and Lauria were frustrating. Not a single shred of evidence had been discovered that could tell police what happened to them, where they went, or why they were taken. Searches even took place as far away as Canada and Mexico, and in January 2000, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. But even still, for more than a year, it was like the case was frozen. There was nowhere to go with it unless new information was uncovered. Finally, in June 2001, a prisoner came forward to accuse a man of being involved, which led to a man's house being searched by police. Unfortunately, the only thing of interest they found was a piece of carpet that appeared to have blood on it. Police cut a square off of it for analysis, but the blood didn't belong to anyone involved in the case. Then after that, known killer Tommy Linsdell came forward while he was in prison to take responsibility for the crime. In his conversation with police, Tommy said that the parents were killed because of an outstanding drug debt that hadn't been paid. As for Ashley and Loria, Tommy claimed he drove them to Kansas and shot them. Unfortunately, he would later recant this confession and reveal that the reason he claimed the crime as one of his own was to leverage his knowledge for more prison phone privileges and better food. So with that, police had a dead end once again. In the years following these dead ends, two separate private detectives would take up the case and discover what they believed was the biggest piece of evidence in the investigation, at least thus far. While a search party walked the property in the days following the fire, someone found a car insurance card on the ground. It didn't belong to the Freemans or Loria, yet it was found on the Freemans' property, which was located in the middle of nowhere. It seems unlikely it would have ended up in such a remote spot by chance. However, when this was presented to investigators, they refused to put it into evidence, seeing it as unrelated to whatever happened on the Freeman property. Then, after enough failed attempts to get police to accept it, one of the private detectives stored it with his case files, where it would remain for several more years. After that, it would be almost a decade later in 2017 before the case reappeared in the media. When the local police department was transitioning to a new administration, they realized the old administration had misplaced notes about the case that should have been stored in the correctly labeled boxes. The new administration came in and sorted through all the evidence in the storeroom and found these misplaced notes. Then, with the help of the OSBI, the documents were reviewed, and what they found in them shifted the entire course of the investigation. Throughout the papers, investigators found a whole new set of names and leads that hadn't been followed up on during the initial investigation. And the more people they spoke with from the list, the more three names in particular kept being implicated. As it turned out, the connection between the murders and the new suspects had been with them all along. Officials then announced the three names in April of 2018, almost 19 years after Danny and Kathy were murdered and Ashley and Loria disappeared. The names released were Phil Welch, David Pennington, and Ronnie Busick. All three men had been in and out of the prison system for decades for various offenses, which often included violence against women. David and Phil were also heavily involved in the drug scene in the city. Apparently, they bragged about their crime to a number of people but followed it up with threats if anyone went to the police. All three of them were supposedly not very smart, but still not to be messed with. Finally, since Phil died in 2007 and David in 2015, those who heard the men tell the story over and over again finally felt safe enough to speak to investigators. Then, in addition to all of the witness testimony, there was some physical evidence to connect the men to the scene of the crime. After that private detective gave up on trying to get the police to look at the car insurance card, he followed the lead himself. And it didn't take long for him to connect the card to a car and the name on the card to a person who just so happened to be the girlfriend of Phil at the time. This woman had started dating Phil in the months after the fire and moved in with him shortly after. They only lived together for a short time before Phil was put in jail for hitting her. Then, while he was locked up, the woman found 10 to 15 Polaroid pictures in a weathered leather briefcase. These pictures were of two girls bound and gagged, lying on a bed in various positions. Horrifyingly, the bed was the same one the woman shared with Phil, who posed for a couple of images on the bed with them. Although the pictures have never been found, Phil apparently showed the pictures to enough people that these witnesses were able to independently corroborate details from the pictures. Unfortunately, Phil's ex-girlfriend threw them into the trunk of a car before it was towed to a junkyard, and the photos were no longer with the car when it was found. But importantly, she said the car was often borrowed by Phil and he used it the night of the fire to get to the family's trailer and drive Ashley and Loria away from the property. That's when the card was lost there. This means that literally the entire time, investigators had the car insurance card that connected one of them to the scene, but were surrounded by witnesses terrified of coming forward. And unfortunately, although this was a huge break in the case, by the time this was all discovered, Ronnie was the only one left alive to be held responsible. After his arrest, police tried to get Ronnie to be cooperative, but because he was facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, there wasn't much incentive for him to work with investigators. Ronnie's lawyer also said that his many years of drug use, combined with a 1978 incident when he was shot in the head, affected his memory so badly that he didn't remember anything about the night of the crime. Either way, because the man had been so forthcoming with so many people, investigators were able to put together a good idea of what happened to the girls through witness statements. The exact motive of the men is believed to involve drugs based on an interview with an ex-girlfriend of David's. Then, after arriving at the family's trailer, at some point Phil shot Danny and Kathy. From there, Phil and David set the trailer on fire after the girls were restrained in the car. Taking the girls was allegedly Phil's idea, and the witnesses report that he took them to have a little fun, in his words. Ronnie told different witnesses different things, but it seems that the girls were alive for at least a few days and maybe even a few weeks after being taken, during which time they were assaulted and beaten until they were eventually strangled. In 2019, in hopes of getting Ronnie to talk, he was offered immunity and a $25,000 reward if he'd tell investigators where the girls' bodies were, but he struggled to recall. He did, however, assist where he could in exchange for a lighter sentence. He couldn't remember the significance of each or if they were related to the location of Ashley and Lori, but Ronnie mentioned to the police that Phil and David threw the girls' bodies in an abandoned mineshaft or in a quarry lake nearby. When those were searched unsuccessfully, Ronnie told police about a trailer that David once owned where the girls might have been kept in a root cellar. But again, an extensive search of the area turned up nothing. For his limited cooperation, Ronnie's charges were greatly reduced and he pled guilty to accessory to second-degree murder. He was then sentenced to 10 years in prison and 5 years probation. But in 2023, after just 2.5 years served, Ronnie was released from prison at 71 years old. As of this recording, Ashley and Lori's bodies still have not been located. If you made it this far, thanks so much for tuning in. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.